All right, the recording has started, which means it's going to be part of it, right?
The webinar has begun. Welcome everyone coming in. It's so nice to have you with us today. We're going to give folks an opportunity to just make sure everything's up and running like they want it to be. I'm Renee Wilson. I'm one of the consultants with Ministry Architects. And here's my good friend, Rob Dyer. Hi, Rob.
Hello, Renee. And hello, everybody who's coming in. Glad that you're here today.
As you know, we are talking about the how-tos of hybrid worship in hopes to give you hope on how to reach more people in your community. That's our goal today. I think we're looking like we've got a pretty good full house coming in the mix, Rob.
We sure do. I was looking down the names. I was trying to pick out a couple of folks I know who told me personally they were going to be coming, and so looking for them. But happy to receive a shout out in the chat from anyone who's here with us today.
Yeah, we're going to ask y'all some questions along the way. We'd love to know where you're sitting today, what position that you or role you hold in your church communities, where you're at in the world. Where in the world? Did you ever watch Carmen Sandiego?
Sure did. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I'm more of a Wiggles guy, I'll just tell you, but that's
there it is. But as people are coming in, one of the other things we wanted to do today is invite you to tell us the thing you are hoping to learn or hear. We know that hybrid worship is kind of a buzz phrase right now, and that there are probably very specific questions or curiosities that you might be hoping we answer, or we at least address in some form or fashion. So right up front, as we introduce ourselves and let you know who we are and what we bring to the table today, we'd love to know why you are here. So if you can put those questions or comments in the chat box or even in the Q&A feature, we want to make sure we address those in the time that we're together today.
Yeah, we have things to talk about, to present, to share with you. But I always like it better when I show for a webinar and I make sure that there's some way that the question that I have or the thing that I really want to hear more about gets talked about. And I often find myself about halfway through the webinar going, they're not going to do it. They're not going to talk about it. So, there right away, we've got one in there. Which got sent to us, how to reach people who are hesitant to come to church. Very good. And Renee is just the awesome helper today because she's going to make sure that like we get back to these things and get prompted through that.
I will. I'll keep a running list, but I think it's important as we start for you to know who we are. So my name is Renee Wilson. I've been with Ministry Architects now for a few years. I work as a staff and a search consultant for our company. My background is in school psychology and youth ministry, predominantly in a United Methodist tradition, actually. And so what I bring to the table today is a big heart for worship. I'm currently a worship leader in a local church setting part-time and work with our pastoral staff there as we, do what most churches do, which is plan for how a Sunday morning or outside of Sunday morning time will go, develop a strategy for reaching people who aren't there, as well as if you teach in sermon series or if you follow the, I want to say liturgy, and that's not right. If you follow the lectionary, how does that all come into play when you're trying to connect with people in a way that's meaningful, that you're not quite sure is bringing meaning to their life? So I wrestle with those questions on the regular, and I hope that I can help wrestle with them with you today. Rob, who are you?
Who am I? My name is Rob Dyer. I'm senior pastor at Presbyterian Church in Southern Illinois, really near St. Louis, Missouri. And I have, I've had a life that kind of led me through a bunch of different paths. I used to be an electrical engineer and did software development for a number of companies. And I eventually got the call, went to ministry, and have served in several churches and been involved at more regional level. And around, I must say 7 years ago, I got the opportunity to start working with Ministry Architects, helping out churches that were going through similar situations as to what I had experienced when I was a client of Ministry Architects many years ago. And I have to tell you that when the church where I'm serving now, when we found ourselves in mid-March of 2020, suddenly needing to move to some type of online worship presence, I was actually very grateful for the master's degree in electrical engineering and technical background. So this has been a very interesting time, I'll just tell you, for me personally, as a pastor who's very comfortable with technology and enjoys working with technology, and then seeing how we can make that part of the community that we build as churches, and also regionally. I see this happening with regional organizations of our churches as well. So it's been kind of a stressful time, as it has probably been for many of you, but it's also been a time where we've seen churches try things that they never could have convinced themselves to try before, to break out of patterns because you had to. And so I'm very excited to explore this idea of hybrid worship, because I think we have churches out there that are moving in this direction in ways that never would have happened otherwise. So maybe that's something, some light we can pull out of this past 18 months that we've all been going through together.
So Rob, I think everyone's here who's joining us today. I'm making sure we're catching all the questions and comments of items you definitely want addressed. There's still time throughout the entire webinar. If a question pops up or there's something you'd like follow up with, please let us know. To kick us off today, Rob, why don't you tell us how we're going to define hybrid worship?
Sure. This is something where there's a lot of different ways that people are trying to characterize what it is that they're doing in their worship experience. But the way we're defining hybrid worship today is like this. If you are doing worship that has an online component, and you are doing worship that has an in-person component, then you're doing hybrid worship. It may be that you might have an online service that happens at 9 o'clock and an in-person happens at 11. That's still hybrid, because you are now a church that's doing both types of worship. Maybe you're a church that is live streaming your current service. So it's one in-person, or maybe it's multiple in-person services, but one or more of them is being kicked out over YouTube or Facebook Live. That's hybrid. Maybe you're doing something where it's actually interactive. So you have a congregation that's in person, and you're interacting with your online congregation and your in person at the same time. That's probably the most complex form of hybrid worship that we see happening as well. So any of these components, whether it's happening asynchronously, where you're recording a live service and sending it out, or you're recording it ahead of time and sending it out, or you're just doing it at a completely different time, or you're fully, meshing the two together, you're engaged in hybrid worship, because you're having to think about worship in both areas of online as well as in person. So that's what we mean when we talk about hybrid worship. It means you are trying to think about this experience of worship in both of these areas. So what I would like to do is kind of get an idea of where you all are in this. And then I'd like to go to some of your questions you've thrown out, because wouldn't it be great if we got to your questions immediately, which I think is going to address a lot of these topics. But I saw a few other kind of side topics that I completely understand how you have those things weighing on your hearts as well. So let's go ahead and put up a poll to kind of get a feel for where you all are in terms of your current experience of hybrid worship. So you should see a poll that's popped up, and it's asking, who's your current audience? So are you doing in-person only? Are you doing online via Zoom, which is it's a very different kind of online experience. So that's why we pulled that out. Are you doing some type of pre-recorded and posted service, or whether it's church website or over YouTube? Are you doing some form of live streaming? Or are you doing a combination of in-person and online during the same service time? So you can select more than one of these if you feel like, I'm really like a little bit of 2 and a little bit of 4, or we're doing it all, and go ahead. So let's go ahead and have you go ahead and vote, and let's see what you've got in terms of your experience. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes there to go ahead and vote. I also see that in the Q&A, we're getting some questions coming through there as well, Renee.
See that, Rob? I'm collecting them in a little note for you and I, just so we make sure we hit them all and they're not lost in the conversation. Nice. But I'm thankful for those who are sharing them with all, so that everyone can have eyes on those, and maybe it'll make others think of questions that they would love responses to.
Absolutely.
Looks like we got 32 of our 33 folks who have answered. which is a pretty good outcome.
That's a pretty good outcome. There's always the one person who's either having trouble technically or just doesn't like polling.
Look at that, 33 of 33, and our results are
all right. So a good majority of you are doing in-person and online during the same service. And it looks like a good chunk of you are doing live streaming. And I'm guessing that what it is that you've got a YouTube live or a Facebook live stream of what's happening in person. If you're doing something much different than that, when you talk about a combination of in-person and online, please throw something in the comments chat so we know, like, no, we're doing something really different. So, but that's good to know that you're thinking about one service that is feeding two different congregations.
I would also say if you have screen capturing capabilities with your device, to take a screenshot of these poll examples. If you wanted to have a conversation with your leadership to say, hey, I was in a webinar with representation from all over the country of different ministry leaders. And what we saw was 79% of folks are doing some combination of in-person and online worship offerings, because that could be fuel for a conversation that maybe you wanted to have or needed to have and just haven't known how to start. So this is also hopefully a tool for you to take back and say, we are only one of two people in a population of 33. So small population, however, representative of, I think, what's happening in our larger communities that are doing online via Zoom or in person only, right?
Right. Okay. Well, let's go to some of those questions you've accumulated there, Renee. I bet we've got some good things to talk about.
We do. I think a really great one to start with is, how do you cultivate an active worship approach instead of a passive reception? So there's worries that just sitting at home and watching worship is happening instead of really engaging with and helping move someone and ensuring that there's active participation in a worship offering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that, with in-person worship, you probably have had a similar struggle. How do we have some type of participation? The great thing about, let's think about that situation. When you're in a situation of in-person only, people are stuck and they have two choices: participate or just sit there and maybe try to do some type of covert phone operation or taking, drawings and such or whatever. But there's a sense of like, I've got nothing better to do. I might as well participate in what's happening in the worship service with the back and forth. And so we can talk about, there's things that you can do in an in-person service to get more of an active participation feel, whether it's through movement, standing up, sitting down, or a call and response type thing, or something that's more interactive where you say, pull out your device and I want you to respond to this question. But when we bring in the idea of hybrid worship and we're thinking about that at-home community as well, we just have to remember that, like, when people are at home, they are going to be distracted. When people are tuning in remotely, some folks put themselves in their little zone. I mean, they sit down at their little desk and they log on and they're like, it's God time. We're going to close the door. We're going to light a candle. We're going to like set the mood and I'm going to, have this time. And I think that what I just said there is the first thing I would say, is that for your online congregation, encourage them to set their own environment. You don't control that. Now, some people are going to fix breakfast. They're going to do laundry. They're going to jog. They're going to have it on in the background while any other type of task is being done. That's just the way they're going to take in your online offering. And you have to receive that and know that and be aware of that. They're not going to hear every word. They're not going to follow every movement. The thing is that you can't fully design a worship service for the distracted listener. But just to be aware of that as you're going through. When it comes to encouraging this in the congregation, though, think about telling your folks at the beginning of the service, right now, let's see if we can make this a sacred space. So for those of you who are online, for those of you who are doing this wrong, maybe think about, go ahead and get that coffee cup filled up now, so you don't run out in the middle of this. Or, if you need snacks, get the snacks done beforehand. Let's talk about maybe going to a special room in your home to participate in online worship, or a sacred space outdoors that you're going to set and make that your space. I'll just tell you right now that where I am right now, this is where I stand when I lead online worship, one of our online worship offerings at my church. And I was telling Renee before we started this webinar, I said, just standing here in this space for me as pastor, I'm in mode. I'm in worship mode. I'm in energy mode. My energy level went up about 20 degrees when we started here. And I know that using this space specifically for this purpose has an effect for me, and it will have the same effect on those who are with you. So I think setting up that environment is a big thing. And the other thing in terms of engagement, and I used to say this was just for online congregation folks, but I really think it applies to the new version of in-person worshipers we have, and that's that attention spans. You got to keep things moving. Any singular element that lasts longer than 10 minutes, you got to really think about that one. Anytime you're going to pull someone past 10 minutes, you really got to think about it. That better be an event that has a very captivating, sustaining type of interaction. But most of the elements of your worship service, just a couple of minutes each. The feeling of movement as you move from one thing to another has a lot of effect on folks. I know sometimes we think about, isn't it wonderful when we're in worship and you have like a long series of music and you really just helps to build that mood. You're right. When you're in person, that kind of, for lack of a better term, concert feel, where you're building something, whether it's through a lot of music or maybe through a long series of contemplative prayer and you're weaving something together, it works fine in person. But when we're online, I don't need 5 verses of that song like I did when I was in person. And then in reality, maybe we didn't need 5 verses when we were in person either. Maybe we were okay moving along. So I think that thinking about the movement, I think one thing that's interesting is to time all the elements of your worship service and just to think about it a little bit. Have someone look back at one of your online and time it, like this took 1 minute, this took 3 minutes, this took 5 minutes, and then compare the elements and say, did we give the right amount of real estate, of time, real estate to each of those movements of our worship interaction? Because that's part of one of the 6 areas that we talk about when we talk about this hybrid worship experience, and we'll get into this a little later, but rhythm and flow, the whole idea of like, how do things move in the service, and we generally don't need those long elements front loaded. We got to build people up into a moment where they're ready to sit with us for a little bit, to know that many people are coming on late. Many people are not engaged until 5 to 10 minutes into what we're doing.
I would add to your lean in, Rob, that what this past 18 plus months has done is to reflect on everything and reassess everything. And while that might seem exhausting to some leaders to continue to do that, can't we just go back or do it this way? Or I'm tired of the reassess. I just want to do what I've always known to do. I think you who are engaging in this webinar are asking questions because you realize it's not reaching people in the same way, or it's not encouraging those who should be in your congregations to return. And so in light of that, it might be good to reflect on what you were actually controlling, if you will, or setting the stage for prior to 2020. So how long were the elements? How much attention and resources did you give each thing? One of the things you said, Rob, about environment was setting a tone for sacred space so that they would actively engage versus passively engage. The tough part is, and it's a story we sometimes tell ourselves otherwise, people could be sitting in the pews or the seats or the rows or however you're worship space is structured and not be paying attention every week.
Yeah.
But they're present, so we think that they're at least there. Meanwhile, if someone's running, that could be the most active place that their brain and cylinders are all firing, and they're truly absorbing and taking in the information that you're sharing. So being mindful of what truly is in our control and what never might have been, but we thought was, could be a good self-assessment as well.
Yeah. I mean, quite frankly, we're often sloppy stewards of people's time when we got them locked in the seat for an in-person worship service. You know, we know we don't want to go longer than a certain amount of time, but how we divide up that time, we're not always good stewards of that. And if you lose someone in the 12th minute of your worship service, then it really doesn't matter whether you got that thing under the 45-minute mark or the 55-minute mark or the 3-hour mark, whatever's your standard for your worship, right? What else do we have, Renee, in some of the questions?
Well, I was going to say a good springboard for that is a question from Charles King, who asked, our in-house sermons and meditations used to run about 20 minutes. Is that too long for hybrid services? And there's a couple different ways to answer that. One of them I'll take right off the bat. How long would you sit through something on your screen that would engage and truly captivate you? If you are setting the baseline stage for what you expect of your congregation, maybe 20 minutes isn't too long. You know, there are some very well-known pastors who teach for upwards of 40 minutes to an hour. And there are other very motivating, inspiring individuals who teach for about 8 to 12 minutes in person. And most of us have watched at least one, if not a dozen TED Talks that get us within 5 or 6 minutes and we walk away going, wow, you know? So we're not here necessarily to prescribe a time. There really is a question of what would you be engaged by and captivated by for how long? And maybe that's a good conversation to have with your leadership as well.
Yeah, and it's so hard to look at pastor in the eye, or if you're pastor, look at yourself and say, how long can they take me? I mean, when you got them in person, it's definitely in person, you can preach longer. I'll just say that. In person, you can preach longer. You get the benefit of a situation where everything else in their world has been isolated. They sit in a seat that's specifically pointed towards you. And there's really not a lot of options for distraction or other places to go. And it seems a little rude to suddenly turn into this during the service, but I totally can when it's an online service. So it's shorter. The question is, how much shorter is it? And it might be that you're preaching in such a style and in a way that it can be the same amount of time, but it's definitely not longer online. You definitely can't go longer, is what I would say.
Yeah, and to close up this sort of rhythm and flow piece of the puzzle, Vaughn asked, with 10-minute attention spans, how would you do a 15 to 18-minute sermon, right? Because you don't want to dissect it down so much that they're not getting enough substance. Figure out how to segment it out. Do you do the scripture in one piece and then jump to a different element of the service and say, hey, when we were reading in Ephesians 2 about it's by grace we are saved, let me explain what grace is. And then that's another segment. And then you jump to maybe a time of giving. And then you jump back and say, now let's put an application to grace being the saving factor to our relationship with Jesus, right? So how do you anyway dissect the message that you're giving, and then be mindful of how you can integrate that, weave that like you would a tapestry. I'm a visual learner, right? And still get the full thread in the piece. But maybe it goes in and out of some other also vital threads.
Yeah. And I think that in any given span, if you feel like you need to go more than 10 minutes, all right, then you just got to think about the rhythm of what you're doing. It's got to have some highs and lows. It's got to have some intensity with a little break and then bring the intensity back up again. I remember a roundtable discussion of stand-up comedians, and they said on stage as a comedian, you're judged every 11 seconds. Every 11 seconds, you better say something funny or say something that entices the person to keep on listening. And the other thing that they said was that the juice has to be worth the squeeze. The lead up has to be worth the punchline. And I think the same thing about preaching is that if your big point If you have a really big point to make, you can take more time to rev up to it. But if you have a small point to make, it should be a very small ramp up to it. And these moments, think about the moments that the message has, just the way you think about the moments that the service has. Because in a way, a sermon can actually be a 3-part movement. It doesn't have to be, you're not going to do well to think of it as one big speech, you
Right.
know?
Right.
What else we got?
Well, let's shift a little bit from logistics in terms of how to, and talk a little bit about who. So we have a couple questions around how does an aging congregation reach younger families in the community, as well as how do you minister faithfully via a hybrid model across 7 distinct generations, all with varying technological skills. So this
I
is an
think
audience question.
it really is. And you have to know who your audience is. And you want your audience to feel comfortable and valued. So ask yourself, how do each of these generations feel comfortable and how do they feel valued? So one of the big challenges that many of the congregations that we worked with had early on in the pandemic specifically was, I have maybe an older congregation, someone might say, and we can't they have a lot of trouble navigating getting to our online worship, which maybe at some point in the pandemic, that's all you had, okay? If you work hard to get them connected, even if you're not successful, that's good ministry. So I think that like, if everyone who has the potential to connect in feels that you are valuing them as part of it, and then working to make them feel comfortable, then you'll find that people will eventually learn things. So I think that offering trainings, offering people who are willing, digital deacons who are willing to go to their house and help them get their computer set up, or teach them how to use the phone line because you have an ability for people to phone in and listen to the services. And then I think that part of you are probably thinking, yeah, like I got the older generations covered. We've got them comfortable. You know, how do I get some of the younger generation feeling that? Well, it's the same thing. Do they feel welcome and do they feel comfortable? And think about what you're doing. And so I really believe it's a context specific question. But I do think that, but conveying your online worship as an alternative that is equally valued and has an equal worth of your in-person worship is a key factor that a lot of churches are tripping over this. There's too many churches out there that are talking about their online worship as a, well, if you can't make it, or, well, you know, if you're just having one of those lazy Sundays, then you can always use our YouTube. Don't do that to them. There's enough authentic online community building that's happening in people's lives, especially younger generation, that the minute that you classify online worship as inferior, as a thing that lazy people do, I really want, oh, I'm lazy, can I be part of that? They need to feel like they're valued and they need to feel comfortable. So you know, I would just watch things like that. I've seen things happen before where like little jokes made about like, oh, our online people probably still in their pajamas, ha 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 ha. Hey, everybody here, let's laugh at the online people who probably are still, you know, like don't, you may just be, you gotta watch that because you want every single person to feel valued there. You wouldn't do that to someone who came in and sat in the wrong pew or in the wrong section of the sanctuary and say, oh, you know, the people who like to sit in the back the way they are, you know. I really think that goes a long way. So multiple ways to connect with an authentic experience of worship, and everyone's an equal participant, no matter how they're.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that, you know, many church contexts talk about C&E people, folks that only come for Christmas and Easter. And we do this in jest and there's some jokes, right? And yet, could those be the only times a year there's an opportunity for them to connect in the community that they've never experienced before and potentially meet our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? It is. And so rather than viewing the numbers going up for a temporary time, it's a mindset shift. Similarly here, Not to make assumptions about the folks who are either engaging in person or online is incredibly important. And have we had the room to stop and assess our own biases? I don't know how many have, because this hit us out of the blue and we've just kept going and we've just kept adapting and we just kept trying. And I don't think as many pastors as have wanted have stopped, paused, and said, whoa, what do I really think of an online option and the people who access that? What do I really believe about an in-person worship? And then what are my expectations and how am I teaching those, modeling those, discipling folks in those as to what worship is and can be? And whether folks meet those expectations or not is another conversation. But do they even know what the hope is of the time that you've been spending gathering or preparing or whatever it might be?
Yeah. I've seen a number of comments that came in earlier. I just want to weave this in at this moment, where people have talked about like, oh, at some point we had so many people online. Where did they go? Or, talking about, gosh, it seems like that we have, so many more people online than we do in person. And that might be the case. But I want to caution you, remember, views does not equal people. And that actually means in both directions. You might have a household where there are 4 people watching one view. But on the other side of things, you might have someone who starts to look at your video and then no, and then is gone in a way. Things get counted as views that are not reliable. And so those of you who are familiar how to use, some of the where you can get the statistics of how long people actually view a video and dig into those stats for your online offerings, that's worth it if you want to get a more accurate count. I think that offering some type of moment where people register or acknowledge that they're there is helpful. But don't be fooled by views. It doesn't equal people. And in fact, in some cases, you might be undercounting from that. One church, someone told me that they had a church leader who proclaimed that it's 1/3. If you have 300 views, that means that you've had 100 people watch. Okay, that sounds neat. Totally non-scientific, and because it's not true. But maybe that's a rule of thumb you want to come up with. But I think that if you are engaging with the people who are viewing your online worship opportunities in a multitude of ways, you'll get a better feel for how many people we actually getting here. And I'll just tell you that like what I'm encountering with a lot of churches that I work with through consulting, the ones that have a fairly good feel for how many folks are online versus in person, I'm seeing a lot of numbers that suggest that somewhere around 30 to 50% of the people attending worship are now online. You have some people who were regular who moved to online. You've picked up some new people, but I'm seeing in a lot of churches where they're offering both online and in person, and they're like, "Oh no, our in-person worship attendance is like half of what it used to be." Yeah, that's what we're seeing all over the place. Now, a lot of that is because people have dropped off. People have faded away. They're not coming back. All right, and we're going to have to re-evangelize them. But there's also a lot of people who just switched to online because it was easier and it fit into the schedule better. Here's another thing I want to throw out there, though. This is something that I'm seeing with a couple of churches, though, is that those people who are coming now are coming more regularly. If you do good attendance tracking at your church, which I hope you do, because it's very valuable, I think what you're going to see is that the number of people who came 3 or more Sundays in the month of September 2021, all right, is probably higher than the number of people who came 3 or more Sundays in 2019. I think there's a good chance you'll see that, because it seems like I heard one person say, it seems like the remnant is more faithful. And so some people would say like, our attendance really hasn't gone down that much, but that's it, because I think people are the ones who are coming are a little bit more regular, and you're getting fewer of those once a monthers. And so I don't know. I think that's just an interesting little bit of stats. Very informal. I'm just going off of a couple of stories from what I've experienced, Renee.
No, it's a perfect segue to another question and just another course of conversation in our last 10 to 15 minutes. And we have some other questions to get to too, so I want to be mindful of those. But Barnabas Sprinkle asked, how do we track attendance online if people don't check in, especially, and you don't know who's on the other side of the camera? But the larger question to that is, though that's a good one to answer specifically, how do you uh, discern the difference between an online worship setting and an in-person worship setting? For instance, how do you engage digital worshipers more? What are the biggest changes you could make in terms of how to include people worshiping online when right there they're in front of you in person, right? So what are some of those differences and the nuances between online and in-person worship, Rob?
Well, I think that with in person, we have ways of taking attendance. With contact tracing now, a lot of churches, everybody's got to sign in, so we have more accurate numbers for in-person worship attendance than we ever did before. Other churches, had the classic sign in and pass the thing down the chairs or the pews or whatever. Other times you're counting bodies. You don't really know who's here, but there were 200 people here. But I think that with the online, we just don't have it set up unless you're registering people for your online worship, that kind of accuracy. So here's the thing: having a more interactive type of a worship service, so that with your online worship, what you have is moments where you're asking the people to do something. Gives you an opportunity to get a little bit more accuracy where they are. If they won't just click on a thing to check in, if they won't just say, hey, everybody, just put your name down as a comment. We want to celebrate that you're here today. Especially if you're doing a live online. If you're doing live online, it can be like, oh, great, Barnabas is here. That's fantastic. I see Ann's here as well. And oh, we got 2 Anns here today. That's awesome. Doubled Anns. And I see Beth is here. And I can look at a participant list with a Zoom, for example. And that's, of course, that's one level of accuracy. But if people are putting things in the comments, you can start to get a feel for who's there. And if you ask for action, let's take this action right now. I want everyone who's watching this, even if you're watching this later, I want you to go ahead and put this in the comments, right? Or take this action or post something on social media with this hashtag. You could take a snapshot for a given time. And at the end of the day, even if you don't have good attendance tracking, you at least get a little better interactivity with folks.
What are the biggest changes though, Rob, between how to approach, not just in timing, right? We've talked about timing, but what are some other changes that you see and differences between in-person and online that can be addressed more intentionally?
Well, I think that for the online, we need more interaction to hold the person at the screen. We need it. A reason to stay engaged. There's things going on. There's things to see in the comments. There's a poll that's coming up. There's a there's a QR code I'm supposed to get. Giving them things to do makes it more engaging, because it's much easier if I'm just sitting to get distracted by that phone that just rang a while ago off to the side, or one of my kids just grabbed something from the kitchen that probably isn't so great. Let's get the whole family here engaged. And so I think that you've got to give them more things. Again, we got sloppy and lazy with in person because you're stuck, you're there. Tell you what, I'll give you a prayer where I say a thing and then you say a thing, and then I say a thing and then you say a thing. Aren't you engaged now? That doesn't work for at home. When you say everybody at home, I'm going to say this and then you're going to say that, they just sit there a lot of times. So go ahead.
Well, what's interesting is when we were talking about that generational question, and if you do worship with others or have young families, children and youth are prone to increase engagement. So if you say, hey, kids watching right now, run to your room and get your favorite stuffed animal, then they run and do that and say, hey, parents, while they're doing that, this is what we're going to do with that, right? And so some households will have some different opportunities to engage differently, because kids are apt to listen and follow along because they do it all the time with the shows that they're watching. Again, it's that setting of an expectation on your adults, or teaching an expectation of your adults, and then encouraging it in a way that they really want to be a part. And that's value added to their lives. They don't see value added in making the cup of coffee beforehand because the first part of your service is boring and wallpaper. Why wouldn't I just turn it on while the music plays and go make my cup of coffee?
Right.
Of course I would.
Yeah.
Which brings us to an interesting point. How do you engage people who are hesitant to return just in general? Is an online virtual option the only way, Rob? I mean, there are people still very worried about COVID and about being around groups of people.
Mhm.
So, how do
I,
we help them worship?
yeah. Well, I think just to remember that the goal of the church is not to put bodies in seats to attend a worship service. So I would, if I started in this conversation with you and we were and we were having this, what I would say is like, let's talk about how you're connected in discipling and helping the faith formation of these people who you're worried about not showing up for worship. Because it might be that during this time of uncertainty, the way that you're going to form their faith is not going to be by sticking them in a room with 100 or 200 or 300 other people. You're just not going to get past it with the pandemic. They're not ready for that. Okay. So let's talk about placing their faith formation ahead of like, what's another substitute worship experience we can give them? So that's just like, that's step one. Now let's go to step two, which is what you really wanted, was how do we get them into a worship experience? Is it only an online is the only other option? I think small group worship opportunities is another way that we can bring people in who are hesitant. So to say that like, adding some other worship opportunities. And I know that if like, as a pastor, I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't want to give that sermon again. Well, maybe it's not that type of service with the full sermonary. It's just to say that, hey, during this time, we know some of you are having hesitancy. So we're having some small group worship opportunities. See if there's an interest in that. Getting people together in groups of 12 in a room that's comfortable and large, or maybe even 20 or 30 for your context is a small group compared to your worship experience. And it's a time we're going to come together and we're going to read scripture. I'm going to share a little bit of the reflection that I did on Sunday, some of the thoughts. We're going to pray together. This is an opportunity for you to really get to try out some things that you never would have had the backing or the inclination to do.
And if you're hesitant to try new things, because people in your congregation are tired of change, have some of that Zoom or just fatigue from the days, which who doesn't? Rob has an excellent kind of different angle you can take when it comes to testing new ideas. Rob, can you talk about experimenting a little bit versus just change?
Yeah, change is a dirty word in the church, and because it evokes the fear response. So when you get someone who really responds negatively to something, the first thing you ask yourself is, what is this person afraid of? When someone's really adamant, no, we shouldn't do that. What are you afraid of? Let's talk about that a little bit. So, and one of the biggest things that people are afraid of is that they're going to lose something that was precious to them, or some aspect of church is going to go away. So what I like to tell congregations is, we're not going to stop this and start this. We're not going to change the worship service. What we're going to do is, during the month of November, we're going to experiment with something during church. We're going to try this out. And then what's going to happen is in the first week of December, we're going to give you an opportunity to give us some feedback on what that was like for you. But we want to give it a real try for the entire month. And then we're actually going to listen to the feedback we get. Now, this only works if you actually want to listen to their feedback. If you could care less what their experience is and what it's like for them, and you're making this change and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, well, then forget it. You might as well go ahead and take the hit up front on doing radical change and moving forward. But people like the idea of knowing that their feedback is going to be heard. And so when you say, I'm going to experiment with this, we're going to try this, that evokes a much lesser fear response out of people, or worry response out of them. So it's like, hey, if it's not good, well, of course we're not going to do it anymore. All right. But don't worry, it's not one of like, Pastor Rob's crazy ideas that now we're going to have to do until Jesus comes back. We're just trying it for November. So yeah, experimentation gets you a lot of grace in using that language of experiment or try.
And you mentioned fear response, and I think in our final minutes, the rest of the questions that we've seen really revolve around that. So let me ask them all, and then we can kind of address a big elephant that's in the room, if I might. So one of the questions is, what are the lies we've been telling ourselves, and how do we find and face the truth about the wheres and whys of attendance? I think, if I might, that goes a little bit to your question of the bigger thing we need to be asking is, what is the faith formation plan of our churches, right? That maybe not doesn't revolve around worship. But at the core of that is this question of, how can we survive? When one participant today is asked, how can our denomination survive? How do I know if we're just mediocre? There's this feeling of competition with churches who have already in place online platforms of productions, or the big guys with far better equipment. And so how do churches avoid mediocrity, avoid this comparison trap, and not trying to seek perfection, but really a product or a way to reach people that's meaningful and doesn't lose them to other places? So what are some lies we've been telling ourselves, and how do we not just survive, but thrive right now into the future?
Right. Well, I mean, the biggest lie, that's come up recently, which was part of the blog from last month that we put out through Ministry Architects, is that they're coming back. Just give them time. They're going to come back. Just wait. Don't bother them. They'll come back. They'll come back. And no, they won't. They won't. Maybe we can reach out and re-evangelize them, but at some point, whatever you're doing isn't worth their time. It's a horrible thing to say, but I'm telling you right now, if you told all of those people who have faded away, you said, next Sunday, we have a special event and we're giving every person who comes to worship $1,000. Every single person who comes to worship is getting $1,000. I guarantee you'd fill that church. You'd fill that church. What you do on any given Sunday is not worth $1,000 to those folks, because they would come if it was 1,000. Okay, so I don't know, is it worth $5? If you gave $5 away, would they show it? You know, I mean, there's some threshold where you could buy people to come, right? But see, our goal is never just to get people to show up, all right? So now we have to think about, what are we really trying to do? And we have to get to a point where, like, I don't need my denomination to survive, and I don't even need my church to survive. What I need is for the witness of the gospel to survive. And I know it will. I know that will, because I have that kind of faith in God. But we want our buildings, and we want our specific church. We might even want our specific denomination. And I don't know, maybe this is an era where we're going to lose a lot of those things, and we're going to be left with nothing but Jesus. And we're going to have to start peddling Jesus instead of peddling our wonderful building, or our gym, or our such and such program, or our, we might have to just peddle Jesus. And so that's a tough realization, because a lot of us have been so busy selling our church that we haven't put a lot of time in figuring out how we're selling Jesus, and we haven't thought about faith formation as much as we thought about just getting people to show up. I hear a lot of people say things like, oh, I just wish that my kids would come to church more often. I wish that they would attend church. But I don't hear a lot of people saying, oh, I wish my kids believed more. I wish my kids had a faith. We're so much more concerned about attendance than faith formation. And maybe that's where we need to turn our attention, not with any one particular silver bullet, but let's turn our attention as churches in disciple making, in faith formation. And maybe if we have that orientation, it'll get us away from just being locked into filling seats in a building. I know that doesn't sound very thrilling if you're facing budget hardships. It doesn't sound very thrilling if you're facing a worry about the long-term existence of your church. But at the end of the day, don't you want to serve the purpose of building up faith, of discipling others, of sharing the good news, and not just being successful at keeping the building open? I think that's what we all really want. We just aren't as certain how to do it. And so that's where I think our attention needs to go in the next term.
I heard a pastor at a conference once say this, and this was when I was a youth minister, and it resonated so deeply. They said, what we win them with is what we win them to. And so concerns and angst and that have existed and may continue to exist about engaging folks either in person or online, and then trying to outdo the last week or outdo the last effort or whatever it is to continue trying to engage them online or in person. What you win them with is what you win them to. And so identifying that goal, what do we want to win them to? I think many hearts are inclined to say, I want to win them to Jesus. I want them to know a kingdom style community that they can't experience anywhere else. I want them to know that they're cared for and loved. In that blog that Rob's talking about, and we'll put the link in the chat, he talks about how can we be trauma centers to our neighborhoods where people have truly experienced some level of trauma over the past 18 months. Some leaders are very concerned with continuing a consistent offering on a Sunday morning or a weekend experience. And there is nothing wrong with that. There's biblical foundation to gathering together regularly to worship, right? There is also biblical foundation to discipleship and walking with and caring for. And I don't know if as many folks as maybe we would hope aren't being mindful of not neglecting those pieces of our following of Jesus as maybe could.
Yeah.
That was a convoluted way of saying it, but basically we can care for others well, and that can matter just as deeply as a consistently delivered worship experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because they've been through, everyone knows we've been through a trauma, a collective trauma as communities. We've been through this kind of collective trauma. And if the church has no response that brings a sense of peace and hope into these circumstances, then maybe we don't have anything to offer the community.
And that's not true. And don't leave here today thinking that that is true. That is just not true.
Right.
And you know it, or you would not be in the positions that you are in. There's a hope and a freedom and a joy and a peace and a love found only in the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And the church gets to be the light that shines that out. How we do it, we can get into the practicals of that all day, and we have been for the past hour. Mm-hmm. But don't lose sight of the purpose that you have been called to.
Yeah. It's why it's to be honest, it's why at the end of that blog, I went to the 23rd Psalm. I went to that Psalm that I recite on a regular basis. I went to that Psalm that reminds me that in all circumstances, that the Good Shepherd is with me, and that I have a confidence that there will be a table set, and there will be an anointing, and there will be some overflowing cups happening, and there's going to be some following of goodness, right? That happens. I mean, there's going to be some of that pursuing by the Holy Spirit of us. We can have confidence in that. It's just we're locked up in a lot of the logistics and a lot of the how we used to do church, the practices, the commitments, the to-do list. Let's not forget the core of what we have. And I think some good's going to come from that. We have a couple of things I want to make sure that you know about, though. Renee's got the list. I don't, because she's better than I am. But of things I want to make sure that you know about that are coming up. Renee?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first is, as you notice with Rob and I's names, we have our email addresses. We would love to hear from anyone who would like further conversation. We always invite a call. We love to know where you are. We love to learn where you want to go. And then we'd love to create a plan to help you get there. And so contact Rob or I, or honestly, anyone on the Ministry Architects team for just a conversation. Conversations are free. And we're all in this together to try to figure this out. So let us know. So that's the first invitation. The second invitation is we have a podcast. It's called The Sustainable Ministry Show. And on episode 129, here, I'll put it in the chat, episode 129 of The Sustainable Ministry Show, they are talking about hybrid worship. And they are getting into a little bit more of the maybe talking through talking about both on-site and online, how to do it in your community, all those kind of nuances that we talked a little bit about today, but they go more in depth. So check out episode 129 of the Sustainable Ministry Show. And last but not least, if you feel like you are drowning, you do not have to be drowning right now. We would love to help you figure out how to swim these waters to survive, or to thrive, not just survive. So please reach out. Please talk. Next month, we have another webinar coming up. It's called The Next Level Leader with Jeff Cochran. So I'm going to put that in the chat as well. If you want to look up Jeff Cochran and you want to look up Next Level Leader, we will be back on October 20th with that webinar and information all month long around Next Level Leader. Last but not least, did I already say that once? Because I'm going to say it again. Next week is the week that we send our monthly newsletter. We send it once a month, and it's chock full of all kinds of information and opportunities to be a part of webinars such as this. So if you are not on that mailing list, it just happens once a month. Please email the address in the chat box. Let us get your name on that, and so we can get you information once a month that is going to be helpful and resourceful to you and your community. Rob, any final things that you want to make sure these folks leave with today?
I want to make sure you leave knowing that you are doing good, holy, and blessed work. And even if you right now feel like you're drowning in it, if you feel like you're overwhelmed, if you feel like you're failing, if you're looking at attendance numbers and you're trying to use attendance numbers to judge the value of the gospel that you're revealing, what I'd say is that your effort, your desire is a greater witness than any set numbers we could pick off to try to measure. So just, I guess, don't be so hard on yourself. You're trying, and the people around you are trying. So take it easy on them. Give them an extra scoop of grace this week. And we're going to get through this challenge that we have in front of us. And we might even be a better faith at the end of this. So let's hope for that.
Thank you all for joining us today. We hope we see you again sometime soon.
Take care, y'all.